imperative.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and call this work session to order on AO 2019-112 regarding the tax spending limit. Let's go ahead and start introduction, starting with this side, Mr. Constable.
Christopher Constant.
Felix Rivera.
Austin Davidson.
Ford Dunbar.
Pete Peterson.
Tyson.
Bill Falsey, the municipal manager.
Alex Lipton, Chief Fiscal Officer. Dean Gates, City Council.
Crystal Kennedy.
And then we also have Mr. Weddleton and Ms. LaFrance not in the room at the time. Okay, go ahead, Mr. Paulson.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think I'm the caboose of this Friday work session train. I'll try to make it as painless as possible. The good news is we're going to talk about math. All right, here we go. So we have in front of the Assembly Ordinance 2019-112 to bring a section of code into greater alignment with the tax cap and the municipality's fund balance policy. We talked about this at some length 2 years ago, and I think most all that we know to say about it is included in the documents. But since you noticed this for an hour, unfortunately, you have now invited me to take you through the sands of time. We're all going to buckle up and go in a time machine together. What is this section 61037? Well, not widely known, there is in Anchorage Municipal Code not the tax cap, but a spending limit on general government operating budgets. So we're going to answer 2 questions. Whose idea was this? Where did it come from? And what purpose does it serve? And here we go. Now we're buckling up to the sands of time. The spending limit was proposed in the summer of 1983 by then Mayor Tony Knowles. What was he doing? There were 2 things that he was doing. The first, and buckle up for this one, we were in a new reality. In 1983, taxes in the municipality were going up for the first time since 1979. Because, dire situation, in 1982, the state was paying for 42% of the local spending, but state aid was declining, and we had to fill the gap, and people were feeling the pinch. So one thing Tony Knowles was doing was saying we have to have some rules as we enter into the new normal when the state is retreating. But I think, I don't think it's written down anywhere, but I think from the historical record we can fairly interpolate. The other thing that he was doing was that he was trying to get ahead of alternative ideas. And there were at least 2. Knowles' spending limit was going up against 2 others. Here from 1983, the Daily News thought Knowles' was the best, and he brought his to the Assembly. And in August 8th of 1983, the Assembly agreed, and they passed what we had today, this spending limit we're going to talk about in great detail. And then the next meeting, they got together and they voted down Don Smith's rival proposal. So then there was one other proposal out in the universe, and it was authored not by Don Smith, but by this character, who I don't know too much about, Millet Keller. I think I found some information that he might have been an early computer scientist, but I don't know much about him. And his co-conspirator, Linda Rexwinkler, and the 2 of them, Rexwinkle rather, were working on Proposition 24, an idea that did not bubble up from the Assembly or from the mayor, but instead was a citizens' initiative that was being brought forth by the Anchorage Chamber of Commerce and something that was called the Anchorage Women's Club Free Caucus, whatever that was. And it is the tax cap that we came to know and love. Interestingly, the newspaper at the time reports that Mayor Tony and Assemblymember Don Smith, who are authors of the rival spending proposals, reacted very cautiously to the tax cap. There's a lot of skepticism about how this would actually work. There's a lot of shenanigans involved in that. The first time they brought it forth with all of the signatures, the clerk said, nope, not enough signatures, and there was a fight about that, a whole court battle. They recounted the signatures. Tony Knowles considered saying this can't even go to voters because it's illegal, and there was not a frivolous argument, actually. The Fairbanks attorney weighed in on the Anchorage tax cap and said, this whole thing is illegal, but Tony Knowles let it go forth anyway, and it ultimately passed by 60%. So here we see the consequence of this. We used to pay $49 million in local taxes in 1983. Tony wanted to take us to 77. The new tax cap kept us at 60, and that was in a world where local spending was matched and even outpaced by state and federal government spending, a reality that we have not been in for quite some time. Here's Sad Tony. Here's Tony saying, I was proposing the tax limit and now I got to figure out how to work. And because you were making me talk to you, I'm also going to reveal this nice little nugget of history. Maybe that'll come after I explain the details. So in order to make a decision about the item you have in front of you, you will probably want to know how does it actually relate to the tax cap. So here is Proposition 24, the tax cap that we have come to know and love. What does it do? It says the total amount of tax that you can bring into the municipality is what you brought in last year with an adjustment for CPI over the last 5 years average, and the change in the population also averaged over the last 5 years. But there's more. You can also do special changes for taxes on new construction or property improvements, so the tax cap is growing by new things that are coming online. I think the notion was as the municipality gets geographically bigger and has more in-the-ground responsibilities, you have to be able to levy new taxes on those folks too. And then two very similar items, taxes required to vote additional funds that are mandated by voter-approved ballot issues. Sorry, that's not a similar item. That's what we've always talked about with our bonds. Special taxes authorized by voter-approved ballot issues, those are what we've been pushing forth as the dedicated taxes. So we say maybe have 4% fed tax just to pay the 9-cent bonds. That's in addition to what we're doing for regular government. Taxes of judgment, to pay judgments and to pay our bonds, and then finally emergency ordinances. The tax cap we have today has a 6, which also said that the marijuana tax was above the tax cap for the first few years, and then it jumped back under. But this was the tax cap. Sure.
So did you say CPI last 5 years and then these on top? Was there something
Yes.
else in between there that I missed?
Population for the last 5 years too.
What
So
do
it
you
goes
mean
by.
Oh, because it's a per capita with the CPI increase.
Well, there's a per capita factor. You say, how much did you levy last year? I'm going to adjust that. You get 100% of what you levied last year, plus the percentage change in CPI. So it was a 1% change in CPI over the last 5 years. Now you're levying 101% of what you levied last year. Plus, if the population doubled, you're allowed to double the taxes. And further, you get to add these things, where voters have expressly said you can add it, or where there was new construction and so the geography has expanded. Okay. Now, this is the one. Go
Could I
ahead.
mention something?
Sure.
Back in the good old days, 1,000 people a month were moving to the city of Anchorage. 1,000, if not more.
You will notice from that chart that even after the tax cap passed from 1983 to 1984, local taxes increased by a factor of almost a third. So, I mean, those adjustment factors were chunky. Unlike today, where CPI is basically 0 and our population is slightly diminishing. And then here is where you'll be subjected to just my gabbing. After the tax cap passed, there was actually a whole brouhaha about what the heck it meant. And Linda is in the newspaper saying, you know, in retrospect, it would have been good to work with an expert who's familiar with writing laws to avoid the kind of confusion we have. I just think it would have been wise on our part to consult with somebody, for him to point out the pieces that we might have missed, save a lot of complexity. And that is the sound of 1,000 municipal attorneys' heads exploding. So, meanwhile, after the tax cap passes and we have Proposition 24, we still have Tony Knowles' alternative, which had passed in the summer. What does it do? It says not a limit on revenues, but a limit on what you are allowed to expend. Expenditures in the general government operating budget for tax-supported services, which has a special definition, but we're starting to feel like the kind of things you can spend tax money on, per capita, so it's kind of also got a per capita function changing with population, are what you got last year. Except you can also increase it by CPI on 1-year basis and not a 5-year basis. And you can increase it to provide necessary voter and legally mandated services. And now there's a morass of definitions that stand underneath that. The first is, what are the tax-supported services that we're even talking about? There's this somewhat dense definition. Tax-supported services are the whole portions of the budget that are funded by anything other than locally generated service user fees, which I believe in the canonical form is charges that we are charging for development services or for inspections from the fire department or IGCs from the utilities. And they include all charges to the non-tax supported services, so the utility payments that are coming over. And categorical grants. So if somebody gives us money, that doesn't count as part of the tax-supported services. You're also allowed to make special provisions for judgments and to retired debt service, and then to do voter and legally mandated services, which they define to be operation and maintenance of capital projects that either got voter approval or were funded by bonds. And the first one is the kind of amazing one. This is where they were anticipating that the state was going to continue giving us Project 80's money, and we would just have a ballot proposition that said, shall we accept $40 million and build a library? And if the answer was yes, then we would also have to do O&M. I don't know that we have ever actually had a ballot proposition that looked like that. The second one is what we actually got. Shall we borrow a bunch of money to build something, and if so, maybe operate it and maintain it? They had exceptions for special assessment districts, for the creation of service areas, and then finally this oddball one about when PERS and FICA changes. So the history was Mr. Keller and his folks wanted their tax cap. Mr. Knowles and his folks wanted the spending limit. When Mr. Keller showed up in the assembly chambers, he said, if my thing passes, the spending limit, if my thing doesn't pass, the spending limit is better than nothing, but if mine passes, your spending limit would become defunct. And we end up, though, with both of these things, and they're similar but different. Some of the differences: the spending limit is on annual changes rather than 5 years. The spending limit doesn't have any provision for emergency ordinances. It's got these odd factors related to PERS and FICA. But the punchline is, it's also been very inconsistently applied, which was the diplomatic way of saying, every time it would have mattered, it appears to have been ignored. So in the early days, the tax cap was much more constraining than the spending limit. That wiggled over time as the factors moved around, and as best we can tell, the spending limit was never even published or calculated that we could find in the 90s, or in the, I think that was the period, early 90s. But we did find calculations where we don't know how the budgets that were actually adopted consistent with the tax cap in 98, 2001, 2003, 2010, or 2013 of revisions could have comported with the spending limit. And I think nobody really told the Assembly that, but we implicitly waived the effect of the spending limit. And as best we can tell, the spending limit has never actually done any work other than to make Marilyn Bonshoff's life much more difficult, because she has to toil away figuring out how to actually create worksheets that show changes in FICA and PERS and whatnot. So how did this all come up? In 2017, we were about to propose a budget, and we were all the way to the goal line. We were using the tax cap calculation, and we had Marilyn in the salt mines turning the crank on that complicated formula, and she said, bad news, everybody, the spending limit has us needing to cut $9 million out of the budget, even though the tax cap gives us all the money. And we brought that to the Assembly's attention, and you guys said, well, okay, we'll put it on ice for 2 years, go study it, and see what you want to do about it. We've done that, and that's the proposal you have in front of you. The intervening period, 2018, after the 2009 budget was going to be $9 million over the spending limit, 2018 we were $13 million less than the spending limit, because the spending limit, for a whole variety of in-the-weeds factors, can wiggle around pretty dramatically. The 2019 budget at proposal was also below, but then after supplemental appropriations and emergency ordinances, we are now above. So the proposal is, the task to us was, 2 years ago you guys said, go study it, think about it, what do you want to do? And we did. And we thought, what is the public policy question? The public policy question is, if you already have a tax cap that is putting the amount of money that you're allowed to bring into the municipality into a vice, why do you need a spending limit at all? What additional work does that even do? Why not just get rid of the spending limit entirely and say, we have a tax cap, we can't spend more money than we're actually bringing in? And what we realized after studying this issue is there is actually an independent role that the spending limit could play. And that is, every year, you should not spend more than the amount that the tax cap brought in, plus don't destroy all of your savings. We have some amount in the piggy bank, and we shouldn't draw it all the way to zero every year without limit. So we have in the municipality a Sullivan-era fund balance policy. It originally said that every year we have to keep in the piggy bank 10% of the current year's revenues as our bond rating reserve designation. So when we have our AAA rating or AA, whatever it is, that's part of what the bond rating agencies are looking like. And we have a working capital reserve or an emergency fund of between 2 and 3%. So we've heard maybe folks heard Mullen talk about the 10 and the 2. This is the 10 and the 2. It was originally calculated as revenues, and then in February, before we all showed up, it changed to expenditures on the recommendation of the bond agencies. So we've had this resolution that sits and guides our decisions. It says, don't violate the 10 and the 2, but it's not a law. It's not written down anywhere. I suppose we could bring you one that said, Jubilee, going out of business sale. We're going to liquidate everything, and next year, it's not our problem. But our proposal then is to say, let's not do that. So our proposal is to say, rather than having this rival spending limit calculation that has never done any work and that doesn't seem to serve any independent public policy utility, why not make it say that? And the new thing would be the amount of money that you can spend every year is the amount you got in from the tax cap plus all the other stuff that you got in, utility dividends, the development services fees, whatever, plus unrestricted fund balance, but only in the amount that unrestricted fund balance is above the 10% bond rating designation and 2% working capital rating. So that's the punchline. We sent it to the Municipal Budget Advisory Commission. They chewed on it. They adopted a resolution recommending support. I think that's going to show up on your agenda tomorrow as a late addition, but that's the story. So there we go.
Yes, Ms. Quinn Davidson.
Thanks. Thanks, Bill. Have you guys put together any materials that would help us describe how this works to the public? Because I can see some misunderstandings as to what this progressive assembly is doing by eliminating the spending limit.
Well, I think the first answer is we've got the documents themselves, I hope, tell the story pretty straightforwardly and in a really compelling way.
That?
Well, you
I
can
mean,
have
normal
this.
people can't
I mean, you can have this if you want it. I'm talking about these actual ordinance and a memorandum. But if there's more to say about that, we're happy to sort of help tell the story. I mean, the initial thought initially at the very beginning was to say, maybe we should just get rid of it. But I don't think that's the message now. Now the message is, let's make it do something useful. So let's keep it. Let's make a spending limit that actually is doing the thing that is what we're supposed to do, which is not spending more than we take in and not dissipating our savings.
Oh, so sorry, I misunderstood. You want to keep it?
Yes,
Just
we want to
change-
revise it so
you
that
wanna
it
change
now
the
says,
formula.
don't spend more than you take in,
Minus the
don't
12,
blow your nest.
or- There's a lot of paper.
One's right there. Yeah, Mr. Dunn.
What's this about?
So I just want to clarify something. I've been told repeatedly that Don Smith is the father of the tax cap, but you're saying it was actually this Millet Keller character and Miss Linda Rex Winkler?
Far be it for me to take issue with Mr. Smith, but his tax cap did not happen.
Buy it on your resume, Don. Buy it on your resume.
Mr. Peterson.
Wow. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so, I'm just wondering, this just popped into my mind, I don't know if this is here, there, or nowhere, but, so we're in the process of settling an LNP. Are we doing this because we're worried that we might all come up with reasons to spend a bunch of that money?
No. The reason we're doing this is because, unlike what we believe to be the received long-standing pattern and practice of administrations ignoring the spending limit when it was inconvenient and just proposing a budget, in 2017, when it was an irresolvable problem, we said, this is an irresolvable problem and we don't know what to do with it. And you guys said, go study it. And this is, I think, our best answer of how to fix it and make it do something useful.
Okay, just thought I'd throw that out there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Peterson. Ms. Kenny.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I kind of wish we had a whiteboard here right now so that you could kind of go up and play with numbers and you could see how all this plays out. Because, you know, when I first looked at this, I thought, okay, it makes sense to me in terms of how we have a tax revenue limit. But it is always interesting, though, to see how spending changes. And what I kind of liked about the spending limit was the idea that you get a number. You know, you get a figure and you can see this is how much more we spent. And technically, you know, you can look at that, I guess, in the budget too. But that would kind of be my question then, is how do we, in this new if we go with the new process, then how do we really see those numbers in terms of what the taxes are being collected versus how the spending is actually changing?
Through the chair, I think there's a couple ways to answer that. First is all of the budgets and all of the CAFRs will provide all that information, whatever level of detail you're looking for. I mean, every year, the mill levy will be set and highly visible. Every year, the amount of expenditures, the spending will be set and highly visible. The second way to answer the question is the revenues and the taxes will continue to be set by the tax cap as they always have been since 1983. The spending limit has never done anything to spending. And now it would do something, meaning that we would say only the amount of money you got plus keep your bank account healthy. That is a material change from what we have done in the last few years. But there's no, with the whiteboard, what you could put on the whiteboard is not a real world change, I think, but you could probably show how the calculations might have differed in various years, but it never touched the ground. We always just said the tax cap controls. And it was, I think, a highly unanticipated consequence in 1983 when Tony Knoll said, here's a spending limit that's better than the tax cap, that it would ever flip, that the spending limit would be more restrictive than the revenue limit that would be proposed as Prop 24.
That is interesting. Can I comment that? Sure. So I guess I'm looking at it as a barometer, so to speak, because certainly there's going to be years where we just don't have the same expenses that we did the year before. And so technically it looks like, well, we don't need quite as much tax revenue, but we're always going to have that tax cap generating that revenue. So I guess I'm looking for something that's maybe a little more simplified to say, and maybe it really is in the documentation, but it is always hard to look through pages of numbers on lines that make it confusing. But so maybe it's really already there. But that was what I thought was actually a very interesting thing to have into place, because I would almost like to see it calculated that way, just to have another way to gauge what's really going on with money in a municipality.
A measure rather than a guideline.
Yeah.
Thank you, Ms. Kennedy. Mr. Dyson.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, you make the best presentations of everyone I've ever known. I wish you had been one of several of my college professors. Thanks. And secondly, second subject, I have an acquaintance who is absolutely sure and broadcasts widely that he's the author of the tax cap. And I think that he's guilty of, was it historical revision or revisionism? Not you, but this has been really useful. I stayed just because of you.
Oh, thank you.
And an interesting subject.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Dunbar.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm holding a wrap in my hand now. So the original spending limit, it uses the term CPI. And CPI can mean several different things. It generally has a meaning, but my understanding is that this measure of CPI did not include medical inflation. Is that true?
Well, good chair, that's a good question. You're right. The charter says CPI Anchorage, right? Which actually is now out of date because CPI Anchorage has become CPI Urban Alaska. But it has a fixed CPI.
Okay.
The spending limit that we have had says July CPI.
Right.
There are many CPIs. I think we have taken it to mean the same thing as the tax cap, but
Well, this kind of, my point is just, the tax cap has worked to limit spending to a certain degree, but this calculation has left out, if it doesn't include medical inflation, has left out the single largest driver of costs over the last, and it wouldn't be just this year or last year, over the last 3 decades. And so you have to go back from the beginning and recalculate it all the way up. And if you did that, I suspect you would be orders of magnitude higher than the tax cap right now. Because we do right now much more with much less on a per capita basis because of our medical inflation costs. That's definitely the case of ASD, even more so at ASD. So I support this proposal, but I'd also suggest that, you know, if for some reason this doesn't pass, we should talk about, you know, recalculating what the spending limit actually meant to be more practical.
Thank you, Mr. Griffin. Mr. Gates.
Oh, thank you. I had some questions about some terms used. I see you deleted the definitions section, and I understand that. But in the new language added to this section, the underlying portions in 61037, you have some terms that are like unrestricted fund balance and the bond rating destinations and working capital reserve. And I did a quick search. Those terms aren't in the code elsewhere. Would it be helpful to have definitions for those, or if not, then why not?
Through the chair, you are correct, Mr. Dean Gates, and that is part of the hole we are trying to plug. Working capital reserve and bond rating designations appear nowhere in the code, but they are in the fund balance policy, which sits in an uncodified resolution. So, where we say, as they are defined in the then current fund balance policy, that is a reference, and I believe we even suggest as a note to the editor that the municipality's current fund balance policy is set out in AR 2015-84. So that's where you're going to find the definition of all of those things. I don't know that we have a formal definition of unrestricted fund balance itself, but by implication, it is fund balance in excess of those two defined things. I'm not sure how else we define it.
Is it possible a future fund balance policy would take a different direction, maybe according to generally accepted accounting standards for governments, and I guess you would just come back to the code change if that ever happens?
Yes, if the bond rating agency said no more AAA rating unless you have 20% in your working capital reserve, the assembly could pick up the fund rating, the fund balance policy, and say it's no longer AR 2015 whatever, it's 2025, and it requires a working capital reserve and a minimum bond rating of 20%. And those by implication be up.
Thank you, Mr. Gates. Any other questions? Yes, Mr. Dyson.
I'm not clear. Where is it we know that the inflation of medical costs isn't in the CPI that we're supposed to go by?
Through the chair, I don't know that. I think it is.
I was asking the question.
Okay.
I said if it's not, then
Should be.
Yeah, I've never heard anything about that, which doesn't mean much, but I'd be very surprised if that's true.
Thank you, Mr. Gates.
And let me say, I really appreciate you all doing this. The state has pages and pages of contradictory stuff. Nobody goes back and cleans up the old stuff. And it's really a mess for anybody that reads very much. Thinks very much. People with calluses too, right?
Yes. Calluses in their mind. Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Any other comments on this? Yes, kind of.
I guess a question, still trying to do the numbers and what that looks like when we work them all out. So if we end up with a year that technically we have collected our taxes under the tax cap, but the spending is much lower, are you saying that there's still a limitation to how much of that money would actually go into fund balance? And if that's true, then what? Okay.
The answer to that question is no. So if one year the tax cap says you're allowed to collect $100, we collect $100, but we spend
That's-
90,
okay.
60.
Okay.
Someone gave us a lot of money. Then we could squirrel all of that into the fund balance in any way. We're not obligated to spend anything. We could pass a budget that spends zero under all of this.
Well, that was my question then, if you don't mind, Mr. Chair. If we had a really great year and we actually only are spending $75, so now we have 25, which is obviously puts us at greater than 10% fund balance. So what happens with that extra money? Actually still stays in fund balance, or it goes back to taxpayers, or what's really happening with that more than 10%.
Yep, it would be up to you. In the default, it would carry over into the new era, the New Year's budget conversation as a huge amount of available fund balance. And you could leave it there, you could spend it all, and we've never, I think, ever refunded money to taxpayers because that ends up being incredibly complicated, but I guess you can figure out how to do that too. But this is a limit on the amount, the max that you can spend, and much like your time limits are a ceiling, not a goal, there's no forced goal here. You could spend nothing. I mean, you could just say, we're out of business for
Okay, all right, so thank you.
Thank you.
So, Mr. Chair,
Yeah.
since we're bonus time and it's Friday, the last thing I will tell
Hey,
you about.
you just said about it's not a ceiling or whatever.
I know, but you guys didn't do this. I spent
Here you
11:30
go.
doing it. So now I will also tell you, I will recommend to all of you, I found all of these newspaper clippings when I wandered into the UAA Consortium Library one day and discovered this amazing set of stacks, which are all these ancient-looking blue 3-ring binders. And I opened them all up, and I discovered it was the Anchorage Times Archives. So back in the day when we not only got a ton of money from the state, but they had 2 newspapers, apparently someone's job was to take the 2 newspapers every day, cut them up, and categorize them. So you can go to the UAA and pull off the shelf Anchorage Assembly 1983 and retrace the history. And it's also by person. So you can pull off a thing that says Chancey Croft or Project 80. So for those of you who are now living this, it's pretty wild.
Have you read Fred Dyson's file?
I don't mind it.
Probably Heather Finn file.
But isn't that a warning, a good warning for all of us?
Yes, if you look
You're
at
gonna
the
be
page,
in a,
though,
you're gonna be in a binder someday.
demonstrates clearly
But it will be in the
where you
sky.
fit in the context of younger to something else. Right square in the middle of that box up there is the look on your face, very satisfied.
All right.
It's appreciated.
What's the
Any
spectrum?
other-
What kind of nurse?
I don't know what kind, but it's I was going to say Moomin people, but most people don't understand that.
Yeah, Mr. Dyson.
Just thinking that, the disgusting thing about my critics is how often they're right. I was just wondering who we should have look at this and see if the administration is conning us, and they're doing some sneaky thing here so they can spend more money on their pet projects. And if they agree that with what the administration is saying, who could give us a good review?
I would think that would be our budget analyst could provide us an independent review.
The advisory commission did.
Oh, they did?
They did. Yeah, so the budget advisory commission sent us a resolution. Would you scroll back to your slide?
Sure.
They did an independent analysis. There, Mr. Crowder.
Yeah.
It's longer than that. I cut the top and the bottom off so you can read it.
Sure.
Yeah, so, all right. I'd like to go out and try and find some critics, and just to hear their perspective.
Could probably find some.
Thank you, Mr. Dyson. Mr. Dover.
I was going to say really briefly, I looked it up, and the cost of medical care is indeed in CPI, although medical insurance is not, which is sort of interesting.
All right. Thank you. Ms. Kennedy.
Well, but we're self-insured.
Thank you. Just in full disclosure, I did send this to Don Smith, the father of the tax.
Did you tell me to stop
No,
reading
the
the
father.
No, I didn't, because I didn't have that history lesson.
Father.
I know, now we really have to put it in quotes. But anyway,
he's gonna
so we'll
get all fired
see
up.
how the naysayers react.
My prophetic motto will say
Yeah.
he's got his knickers in a twist today.
All right, thanks. Seeing no further questions or discussion, that's it, guys. Thanks.